Well, thank you. It's either lunch, dinner, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Today, we're happy to have with us John Ford as our presenter. John is a senior research psychologist in the Office of Policy and Evaluation at the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board. Before joining the board in 2003, John worked for the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, and before that, as an applied psychologist for a private sector consulting firm. While at the OPM, John conducted competency modeling and assessment projects for OPM and other federal agencies. During his time at MSPB, he has conducted research on reference checking, competency, trainability, assessment of training and experience, and other topics related to personnel selection. John has also published a number of papers using WordStat and QDA Miner in his research. He'll be making the presentation today on competencies needed for success by U.S. federal employees, as the slide says. When John's finished his presentation, you can ask questions by using the chat feature, which is the little bubble at the top right-hand corner of your screen. And this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on our website afterwards, probably posted later today or tomorrow. And John's contact information, I believe, is on the last slide of this presentation if you would like to follow up with him later. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to John.
Thank you, Tony, and glad to be with you all today. I'm going to be talking, as Tony said, a bit about competency work and research that we've done and that has employed text analytics. As an overview, I'm going to give a little bit of a background about our office so you have the context for the kind of work we do. Then I'm going to talk about how we've studied using surveys, competencies needed by federal employees in a general sense. The second part will be about how we use text analytics to investigate emotional labor, those parts of jobs that employees have to control their emotions, and that introduces an additional burden into what they do. And finally, I'll close with how we use text analytics to improve our employee engagement scale. That'll be interesting for those of you who may be new to text analytics, because it's a back office kind of thing that you could jump right into and do yourself with very little prior experience if you have access to survey data. So, to begin with, again, the Merit Systems Protection Board is a small U.S. federal agency. There are a little over 200 of us. And the primary way that the board is known among federal employees is that that's the place to go if someone has been fired or disciplined in some way that one disagrees with. You can bring your case to the board and it can be heard at the board, and a determination will be made whether that was fair. So most of the agency is made up of judges and attorneys who do that sort of work. Our office, Policy and Evaluation, is a small part of that. There are about 10 of us who do research on the federal workforce. We sometimes ask questions directly of federal agencies using interrogatories. We also do periodically a government-wide merit principles survey where we investigate whether, in general, merit principles are being followed, people are being rewarded according to the work that they do rather than other non-merit factors. And we look at whether prohibited personnel practices such as nepotism and so on are being avoided. We are staffed with an interesting mix of people. Some are research psychologists like myself. Others are human resources specialists who know the ins and outs of federal HR, the regulations and the processes, and are good at studying them. And we also have evaluation specialists and management analysts. So we're an interesting little group that isn't quite much like the rest of the agency. And the thing that occupies a lot of our work, even though we do smaller surveys, are what we call our merit principle surveys that happen every 3 or 5 years roughly. We look at the issues I talked about, the health of the merit systems. We also have more focused research projects that are sometimes part of that. We've been doing that for about 3 decades. And our sample is a great size sample to work with. It's about 100,000 full-time non-seasonal government employees. And we do that in a web-based way through their email addresses. Response rates range from 60 to 40, and I put that backwards for a reason. It used to be we get about 60%. Now we're happy to get 40%. Like with survey research across the spectrum, response rates have been dropping, so we find it a challenge to try to keep that up as much as we can. Those surveys included open-ended questions in the last 4 administrations, and so you can watch for it. The 2021 administration is scheduled for this January. The data I'll be talking about in this presentation comes from various editions of the Merit Principles surveys. So we look at our first topic, competencies and open-ended responses. I'll note that on the introduction screens to each subtopic, I've put some references. If you're interested in copies of the slides, I can send them to you if you contact me after the presentation. I don't expect you to scribble down these long links, but those are some of the reports that we have drawn on in order to do the work I'm talking about. So the first issue we have in wanting to look at what's going on with training with federal employees is what's the language of training? And of course, there are many different languages that we could use. It's most natural to talk about the class names, the course names that employees go to, sign up for, and whatnot. People who are more closely involved with the courses talk about training objectives. Knowledge, skills, and abilities is a more comfortable language for federal employees. That's often how we talk about jobs. And it used to be the case that anytime you applied for a job, you write a knowledge, skills, and abilities narrative. So employees are very familiar with that. IO psychologists, they're familiar with job tasks, and of course employees themselves are familiar with them as a way of studying the job. We also think about the mental abilities that it takes to do jobs, and more specifically about the competencies. Defining competency as something that is an ability, but it's something that has been shown to differentiate well between high performers and low performers. So those are the various languages in play. And we wanted to focus the open-ended question we were going to ask about training a bit, so the people responding were using a natural language to them about what training they needed, and that we could interpret that in the most useful way. So in order to do that, we wanted to work within a competency framework. And fortunately, well, first of all, here's the question we ask. You can probably see the influence of us having all the lawyers in our agency. Our questions tend to be a little bit longer maybe than they should and qualified. Here we're asking people to describe the most important skill or ability that would improve performance on their current job. And we put a little bit of additional qualification there that may have not have been necessary, but we want to be sure that we're being precise and understood. And that's what we were presenting them with. When it came to classifying the responses, we started with the executive core qualifications. This is a set of competency qualifications that the federal government uses for senior executives, people at the highest positions of leadership just below political appointees. And they have a set of these bolded headings are the core qualifications, and they had a set of 27 competencies listed under those of various types. It's a good set for us to use in studying the entire workforce because it incorporates a number of general abilities relevant to federal work. And we took that as a starting place, and then we tinkered with it a little bit. We made some of the descriptions a little more general so they apply to all federal employees, and we organized them into a framework according to how easy it is to train people in those. Some fit under knowledge. They're things that anyone can pick up. It may take some longer than others, but pretty much that's accessible to everyone. The language and social and reasoning competencies are those that, yes, everyone can learn, but some people bring more natural ability to the training experience than others do. Reasoning would include mathematical things, for example. And finally, we have a couple of less trainable competencies that are more like traits or characteristics that aren't very susceptible to efforts to change them. They can change, but it's much more difficult than simply someone incorporating some information. We use that as a framework to classify the responses to our training needs question, so we could make some points about the importance of whether a competency is trainable or not in terms of managing the federal workforce. So, jumping to the analysis now, this is a screen from QDA Miner, and I have a couple of those to just give you a feel for what we did in classifying these open-ended responses. You can see on the left side of the screen, the OPM competency framework is listed there as a set of codes that we can apply to the data. The particular record we're looking at, shown in the middle, they've indicated that patience is an important quality for them to develop. Over on the right, you see that it's already been coded. When we started this, of course, nothing had been coded yet, but it is coded in this data set. And the primary work we did in order to do the coding was to use the cluster extraction aspect of QDA Miner. We pointed it at the particular question that we were interested in and wanted it to look at uncoded text segments. We also used the stop words in English so that we could filter out the most common and less relevant words, and to begin reasonably large cluster size to put things together so we could consider them. After specifying that, QDA Miner gave us a choice about whether we want tight clusters where things are very similar, or we want to loosen things up a little bit and have somewhat less similar things included. We begin by looking at the tight cluster. That gives us the things that are very clearly related and lets us deal with them first. And this screen has a lot on it. It's the workplace screen for dealing with using the cluster approach. And I'll sort of give us a quick guided tour of three parts of the screen. In the center, you can see selected the original response that we were looking at that says patience. And it's found in the data a number of other responses where someone has said exactly the same thing. Early in the stage, it'll often find these sorts of things that are very easy to see that they go together. And one has some choices here. In the item codes column, one could click there and then select the appropriate competency on the left. You see that we've classified this as resilience. And you could do that response by response. But the real savings in time, if you look at the cluster column, that's blank, but you could click there and it will classify all of those responses as belonging to resilience. And that makes things much quicker. And to the right are a list of records with similar responses that weren't quite similar enough to make it into the cluster. You can review those and add them in as well. It really helps to be considering similar things at the same time, rather than looking at them in the order they came in and shifting your attention. Another way that the interface supports you well is after you have done a number of classifying, the machine intelligence behind the program begins guessing which category each new thing goes in. And it'll indicate that by bolding one or more of the competency categories on the left. And it's not always right, but it often is. And even when it's not correct, the thinking that you have to do about whether it is or not helps you to do good classification. So we spent a certain amount of time on this screen, and it does speed up classifying of your open-ended responses quite a bit. That may not be obvious to some of the people working around me, because although it does speed up the analysis, it doesn't always speed up the analyst in other parts of the research work. I'm one of those people that tends to get lost in a lit review and other things like that. And that's on me, but it did speed up the analysis and aid with consistency and organization of that. So that gives you a feel for how we classified those open-ended comments. And then it went to reporting the results. We went to this language of trainability of competencies that I alluded to before. And we talked about the fact that for the most part, people want to develop things that are fairly easy to develop training for, but we should give some thought to reasoning and mathematical things, which there seems to be more of a demand for than we thought. And as it probably should be, not many people were seeking training on those competencies that are very hard to change. We did this basic framework of working with the language of KSAs in an open-ended question and classifying them into competencies across similar questions across a number of other surveys, and found some interesting results that I'll highlight for you. You can look at our competencies report to get more detail. We were able to go back to the executive core qualifications and present this to more senior people who were used to those in the context of that model. It's helpful to be able to shift between the trainability model and the ECQ model using the same data, depending on what you're communicating about your data. That's a nice flexibility that comes with open-ended questions. The thing that's fun about presenting this particular front slide is to point out that in this, and the bars you see changing in color show different leadership roles within our survey respondents. The darkest bar are non-supervisory employees, and then we progress upward through team leaders, supervisors, managers, and senior executives. And if you look at getting results, it seems to support the idea that as you progress up the levels of leadership, getting results becomes less important. That's always a fun thing to present. You see the look of concern on people's face. In fact, getting results is more important than any of the others, and that drop-off reflects a different emphasis in the other kinds of training that people at that level need. Probably the really most interesting thing in this is what we call the supervisory jump. If you look at the leading people qualification, notice that leading people, or primarily social skills, takes a large increase in demand as one hits the supervisory level and is high after that. It highlights a training need that is different for those first entering into supervisory responsibilities. There is a follow-up report that my colleague Tanya Page did on training for senior executives and what's available that is an interesting place to go after seeing that result. So that's a place some of you may want to follow up if you're interested in that topic. In subsequent survey administrations, we use the same framework to ask about the most important competency for the job that they're doing rather than that they needed personally. Gave them a scenario about what if someone were hired to do a job exactly like yours. Interesting things there. Again, we can see that the less trainable competencies represented by the red bars are important to the job. People just were not seeking training for them. We also ask about people's most recent training experience. And again, we're glad to see that people were not, for the most part, trying to seek training on things that weren't likely to be changed by the training. We did follow up on a bit on those who did. It was interesting to ask their reasons for seeking that training. Many said that they were doing it because their leaders had asked them to do it rather than because they felt a need to. That was something we felt it was important to point out to leaders. It was also interesting to discover that of people seeking training in those less trainable competencies, they were more likely to be going back to training to repeat it for something that had not worked for them previously. So there's some indication that when you try to train something that isn't terribly trainable, you get frustrated and keep trying to do it. That might be a good idea to prevent that. And finally, a table here that we use to communicate at sort of a high level about all of this. This has the dashboard feel that a lot of times senior executives like to see. It summarizes these different competencies and how trainable they are, and relates it to another question that we've asked a number of times over the years about whether or not respondents feel their agency does a good job with training. And when they're trying to train, more often the untrainable competencies, it costs them in terms of credibility with their employees about doing a good job with training. So again, if you're more interested in these results, you can look at our report. This table that I've reproduced has a bit of a faded newsprint look to it because it comes from our Issues of Merit newsletter and an article about this research. That newsletter is put out 3 times a year by our office, and is available. You can sign up for it on the website if you're interested in tracking it. It's been edited for a number of years by my colleague Laura Chagru, and we all contribute to it as we do different research projects within our center. Well, that's the first section on general competencies that employees need. Next, we want to move to talking about emotional labor. And that is an interesting topic that has recently become more visible within the human resources arena. The idea that some jobs are just emotionally difficult. A good example, and a very common example, would be customer service jobs, where people have to deal with very angry or upset employees, and they have to restrain themselves and perhaps not behave in response as they might naturally want to do, but in a professional and productive manner. Another kind of emotional labor job is that done by emergency medical technicians, who are first responders on a scene where there's often been an accident or something where someone is injured. And even if that person is injured quite seriously, they need to project calmness and reassurance and bring the situation under control. And as you might expect, that takes a toll on people. We have done a report on emotionally laborious work in the federal government. My colleagues Peter Leeds and Sharon Roth have done the most on that, but I got involved a little bit looking at finding evidence of emotional labor in some of our open-ended questions. In order to do that, we needed to build a dictionary that would find emotional labor language. And in order to do that, we drew from three different sources, which we tracked through the project. One was seed language to begin with, and we were fortunate there. One of the prominent researchers in the field, Mary Guy, has developed a set of questions to determine how much emotional labor is involved in someone's job. She and her colleague Sharon Mastracci have used that quite a bit, and they allowed us to use a subset of those on one of our surveys. So we had a direct measure of emotional labor, and we were able to take those questions, which are phrased as statements that you agree or disagree with to some degree. My work requires me to provide comfort to people who are in crisis. Strongly agree, agree, neither, disagree, or strongly disagree. That gives us some data on people's jobs. We were able to take the relevant language from within those questions and use that as a beginning place. And then we were able to use the resources available from WordStat, specifically the WordNet thesaurus, to find similar language to the seed language, to expand the coverage. And finally, we took that back to a set of open-ended questions and did a keyword and context review to look at the other language that was also used when the seed and similar language was used, to further expand our ability to capture the language of emotional labor. The particular open-ended question we were using asked employees to describe the most important task in their job that they did regularly. And interestingly, when we wrote that question, it was part of the competencies work. We did not envision that we would be addressing emotional labor at all. We simply asked that in a general sense, but then thought, well, if they're describing what's important about their jobs, might there be some hint of that emotional labor in that? So again, here are some WordStat screens to give you a feel for what we did in developing the dictionary. First of all, we took that seed language that we had abstracted and simply imported it in and turned it into a dictionary, tracking that seed words and seed phrases came from our starting point. Then we used the dictionary builder available within WordStat. This is a useful and complex tool that could use a training session all of its own. We were able to take the seed language and find out other words that were associated with it, first by saying which sense of the word we were interested in. And using those resources, we were able to, again, expand our set of related terms. And finally, as I mentioned, we took all of those terms into some real data and looked at what other terms were being used by people who used them and used our judgment to extract some of those. Here you can see someone is talking about anger. They're also talking about hostility, and that's how we pick up some additional terms. We tracked all that, and to give you a feel, the resulting dictionary consisted of a number of words related to negative emotions, negative behavior, some related to very carefully handling people that are difficult and keeping one's feelings in check, responding appropriately, and of course, terms that they used about the people they were dealing with. That seems to be a real growth area in the language, are terms to describe people that are difficult to deal with. And we got a lot of those. As I mentioned, we tracked where we got each of the features. And this was an interesting thing we found about dictionary development. As you see from the chart on the left, this is a chart showing how many features we got from each of those activities. The seed language was relatively small number of terms. When we expanded it to similar language, we got a lot more terms. And finally, going back with the natural language, added a moderate number of terms to the dictionary. And if we were evaluating those language sources just on the number of features, words, and phrases that we obtained from each source, we'd be pretty enthused about the similar language. However, when we looked at the cases identified, when we used the dictionary, we found that the natural language was much better at identifying instances of emotional labor. And that was true both for the original open-ended questions that we used to develop the dictionary, which you would expect, and that's represented by the blue bars in the chart on the right. But it was also true of a new set of data from an open-ended question about most important tasks, and that's represented by the green bars. So that was, the natural language was a more productive source. This caused us to think a bit about how to track the relative productivity of different parts of the dictionary, and we started using a dictionary information measure that would let us compare the performance of the sub-dictionaries and would also let us look at what happens when you use the same dictionary across different data sets. Very simple, we just took the number of hits that each subcategory got, divided by the number of features it has, and then each time it's expressed as a percent of the total number of hits for the whole dictionary and a percent of the total number of features in the entire dictionary. And we just use that as a rough indicator of dictionary performance. So a dictionary information measure, there are better ways to do this, I'm sure, that have been developed and will be developed. One of my colleagues is very enthused about this one. I think it's because it gives him a chance to say Ford's dim and claim he's always talking about our dictionary work. But in any case, we learned some things about the relative productivity of different language sources. And I think there's a lot more to learn there. And I'm eager to learn what other people are doing and to develop that further. Okay, a few other things about emotional labor that we learned. The data set that we used is the same as the data sets we use for competency work. So these open-ended questions had already been classified according to the 27 OPM competencies and according to our competencies related to trainability. Competency models and those who design jobs. And we were able to support that by saying it's not well recognized, but it's there. Here's how you're classifying the descriptions of jobs that involve emotional labor. You're looking at conflict management, resilience, influence of negotiating, and some other things. It's there, you're just not teasing it out and making it explicit. So very useful to be able to take our open-ended data that have been used for another purpose, approach it again with an emotional labor dictionary, and find some new things about it. Well, did all of this work? A cautious yes. We used the dictionary, coded the survey responses by whether or not they had emotional labor language features. Please forgive me for my affinity for corny acronyms. Yes, ELLF is what we're calling it. My colleague Peter Leeds did a binary logistic regression and looked at the relationship of the presence of this language to other things in the survey related to emotional labor. And we found some things that you would expect. It's positively associated with the respondent being good at getting people to calm down, dealing with emotionally charged issues, with experiencing repeated aggression and maliciousness on the job and conflict, and negatively related to some other things. Some of those, like education level, we don't completely understand, but some interesting findings. Another aspect of having done this work is that it's changed a little bit the way we think about conflict. For a number of years, we've had a set of questions we've used to ask about conflict on the job, and our assumption has been that conflict is something that intrudes into work. Someone, a stakeholder, a customer comes in from outside and causes a conflict, or there is some personal issue between employees or between an employee and their supervisor that results in conflict. And those things do happen. But we also recognize that sometimes the conflict and things associated with is inherent in the job itself. And that's important to recognize that and do some things to help people deal with that. So that was an important message of our research brief on that topic to federal supervisors. And that brings us to the end of our discussion of emotional labor. And we can talk about the last application, doing some text mining to support employee engagement. The context for that is an employee engagement scale that MSPB developed and has been using in our surveys for a number of years. My colleague Doug Nearly has led that effort, but he's been assisted by others like Peter Leeds, a little bit by myself at the beginning, and Lorraine Lattimore and Julia Sowski have also played a role. A number of people contributing to that employee engagement effort that Doug has led. You can find out more about it using the links here. What we have been doing is reporting on that in addition to using it. The scale we have is 16 items based on a number of workplace climate factors, and in that format that we're very used to in surveys, the 5-point agreement scale that allows people to indicate things about the workplace showing that they're engaged. Well, having used this a time or two, we began discussing how to improve it, both to make sure the items that we had, the questions we had, were performing appropriately, were correlated with each other in the way that we would expect, and also to see if there were some other aspects of engagement that we were not covering that we ought to. And we did the usual things in order to make that happen. We were reviewing other engagement measures, updating our literature review on the nature of engagement, and engaging, of course, in those high-quality office discussions that produce good ideas. And in the middle of that, we also wondered, we took note of the fact that we had another unrelated open-ended question on this survey, and basically we're fishing a little bit to learn some things about performance. We asked the respondents to please describe one change to their work situation that your agency or supervisor could make that would improve their personal job performance. And since we had a measure of their engagement level, we wondered if we could learn something about the difference between highly engaged employees and less engaged employees and how they responded to this question. So we took our data set into WordStat and just did a rather informal thing. You can do a very disciplined quantitative analysis with WordStat, of course, but we just looked at language differences between employees with different levels of engagement and focused on some interesting terms where there seemed to be big differences. And when we found a term, as we did here with resource, even though that's not a statistically significant difference, we followed up with the keywords in context feature to look at what was being said about resources. And here you can see focused the keyword of resources along with the language that comes before it and after it in each record. And we've also included the column that reminds us of whether the person saying that is a high engagement or a low engagement employee as measured by our 16-item scale. And as we did that, we took some notes about the patterns that we saw. Again, the sort of thing that you could do day one if you have a data set and start using WordStat to explore it. And here are some of the patterns we found. Pattern one had to do with how employees see barriers. Engaged employees tend to say they don't have enough resources. Give me an extra pencil, I can write more, kind of a thing. Disengaged employees say they have a bad work environment. Things are terrible here, nothing can happen, it's just bad. And we took those two perspectives and turned them into agreement or disagreement statements that we could use a 5-point scale with. You see those questions on the right. Again, our questions tend to be a little longer than many people's, but these were the draft forms of the questions. And we also saw another pattern that had to do with attribution of blame. Everybody was blaming a little bit, but the engaged employees tend to blame other employees, their peers. Someone's moving slowly, maybe they're like me, writing a report slowly, or they're doing something that's disruptive. Disengaged employees blame management. It's all the supervisor's fault, or the people above the supervisor. They're running this place in a way that just gets in the way. And we turned those two things into questions as well. And the good news is, well, the great news would be if the questions derived from a text analytic approach were far superior to the questions from other sources. That's not the case, but they were just as good. We had our original scale items. We had those we derived from an additional literature review, those we derived from consulting our research agenda or related to topics, and those derived from text mining that I've described to you. And they all had a reasonable high correlation with the other items, and the reliability did drop if you removed them. So we were able to move forward with those. And once again, it's a very productive thing to use closed-ended items on your survey to help you mine the open-ended items and look for trends that may bring up other things you want to either measure or conduct research on. And we found that productive. Well, to wrap up, I'll say here are some things coming from us in the near term and in the far term that you may be interested in watching for. It's in draft form now, and in the next couple of months will be available. We are looking at a construct called the Confidence and Ability to Perform Successfully in the Federal Workplace. Yes, they're letting me make acronyms again. This is really looking at locus of control, whether people feel like they're in control and can make a difference, or whether they feel like their environment is causing things to happen no matter what they do. The term locus of control was not terribly comfortable to everyone reviewing our work, so giving a nod to a local sports team, we decided to come up with a punchier way to talk about it. You can look at our website, you can see that available in coming months. Next on the agenda as far as text analytics goes, we've been collecting across several years a large number of federal vacancy announcements, job announcements basically. They are required to all appear in one place, the USA Jobs announcement system, where people go when they're interested in a federal job. And we're interested, having looked at competencies in other ways, we're interested in what sort of competencies people are asking for in those job announcements. And we did a report a number of years ago that found that these job announcements were not very appealing. And we had to pull a small sample of them to do that. We're looking at being able to use some text analytic techniques like the Hiller verbal ambiguity scale to take a more systematic look at the quality of those job announcements. Those are near term. Further term, love to take another pass at the emotional labor language features dictionary. Like to make better use of the rules and category structures to get broader coverage from that, and take a harder look at what makes good seed language. There are some other sources we could have drawn on for seed language that might have given us a broader base to start with. Less immediately realistic, we'd love to take a look at, well, I would love to take a look at the language used in performance appraisals. Those are, of course, very sensitive, and we're thinking about how to, in a very responsible way, get access to those. My colleague Tom Stetson and I, a number of years ago, looked at promotion recommendations in one federal agency and found some very interesting things there. Although there weren't systematic differences between men and women in terms of the performance ratings received, there were differences in the nature of the recommendations. Men were more praised for task performance, and women were more praised for their people skills. And it wasn't possible to tell from the data whether there really is a systematic difference in the way that those employees were going about things, or whether that was some form of prejudice that was in the minds of their supervisors. There's more of an interesting nature to be found there. I mentioned that I'd like to know more about seed language. I think I would also like to make more extensive use of topic modeling. In some of these projects, we did them before I was very familiar with topic modeling. The early competency work, where we looked at broad sets of competencies, I've revisited with topic modeling, and it's gratifying to see some of those same competency groupings popping right out of the data when you run a topic model analysis on it. It's gratifying because it's a validation of what we did in terms of the clustering, but it's also a little frustrating because you think, gee, I wish I had taken this approach back then, but we learn. That is, I think, the end of the material I have to present to you. The next screen has my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, any thoughts, if you would like a copy of the slides to extract the links or other information. And I very much appreciate you listening to the presentation. Tony, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, John. Thank you very much. You can hear me, John?
I can.
Okay, good. We have several questions. The first of all, many people are saying, I'll give you some kudos first. How about that? It'll get you ready for the Very cool. Love what you did here. I would really appreciate receiving the links to the articles used for this. So the grant, maybe you can get in touch with John and he can send you the links. And
happy to do that.
Wonderful. Oh, wow, that's a good one. And great presentation, to which I agree. So those are your kudos to begin. Now here are some questions. So we're talking, this is, I think, in reference to the first of the three segments. I saw that people often use the same words. Would there be a way to automate the analysis of those responses?
Probably. I think that the way we did it, the finding of the same words was a very easy thing that took place early and was quick to do. And that can be done so quickly that it hadn't really occurred to me to further automate it. One of the things that's nice about using QDA Miner the way that I did in that project is you really feel like you have your hands on your data and nothing is happening outside of your view. And I like that. The strength is it takes those and presents them to you together. So I think I would not want to lose that. So while there may be a way to do that, and I'd be interested to know about it, that's not something we pursued because it was enjoyable to just see the data and know what's going on.
Okay, another question. What could be other applications of these techniques in a company's HR department?
Okay. Well, I think there are a couple. One is the general strategy of doing language translation, not from English to German and the way we usually think about that, but in letting people express their opinions in the language that's natural for them, and then doing a translation of that into the categories that are best for analysis, and then those that are best for presentation while still remaining true to the data. That's a good general strategy with open-ended questions. Another, I think, technique that's useful that people may not all think of immediately is how to have open-ended questions and close-ended questions work together to get you the information that you need. Write good, focused, open-ended questions that get in the general topic area, and then use the answers to closed-ended questions to split them into groups for analysis. That's a very helpful thing, whether you're asking about competencies related to training, whether you're asking about requirements for a job, or perhaps other issues. At the technique level, I think those are two that I think are readily generalizable to other tasks that an HR specialist would be doing.
Okay, thank you. Would the dictionary that you built be useful to others, HR professionals, for example?
It might be, and I think others of you who have developed a dictionary will understand this feeling, would really want to take it to a 2.0 level to tidy it up and improve it before we made that available. My guess would be, if we went that next step, that we would likely make it available. We're a public research agency, so we're not for profit. If we did that under the auspices of MSPB and did make it available, it would be freely available. So if that happens, you'll know.
Okay. How much time do you think you saved using these techniques? I think I'm talking now about the dictionary part compared to manual coding.
I'm not sure. I think the tasks that I described were done within a week, along with other things that were being done. Before that, it was more than a week process. In terms of the amount of data we were looking at, maybe this helps. We get about 40,000 responses. Some of those are blank. We're happy when we get 3/4 of those, or 30,000 people who actually say something, as opposed to having filled out the rest of the survey and not answered the open end. So it may have saved us, I think it'd be fairly conservative to say that it cut the time by at least 50%, and probably more. The big thing I think there is the degree of organization that imposes on the process. It's very, very helpful to be looking at similar things at the same time. Even if you classify them differently or do something different with them, that's a very different experience, having had some natural language smarts determine what that similarity is, as opposed to slogging through a long list of things that are only similar by accident if people happen to respond at the same time. So I'll go with 50% or better there, and that's why.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so these are, I'll put these two questions together. What about personnel selection? Could you use the WordStat techniques for that? And as part of that question as well, what about resumes?
Well, I think it's useful in that area. I'm going to talk first about other things that I know that have happened with automated processing. There is the Office of Personnel Management does some writing sample processing as part of the applications they do for themselves and for other agencies. And the kind of things that are done to evaluate writing samples are rather specialized, and there are some groups that are focused on that. And I don't see immediately how you would do that with the current version of WordStat. However, the important role I think WordStat would play is making the HR specialist an intelligent interpreter of what these other scoring algorithms are doing. It's an unfortunate case that when you sometimes use one of those contractors, you can see that there's good validity evidence and that their scoring is doing a good job, but it's a bit of a black box because you don't know why. If you have a good tool like WordStat, you can also look at the same data that they are using and ask them questions about trends that you see there. I'll give you an example. When I was at OPM, we were doing some of that. We were processing essays that were written as part of the Presidential Management Intern Program. That's now the Fellows Program. It's progressed on. But at that time, we had people write basically an essay as part of that. And we looked at that with WordStat, looked for trends and themes within it, and got some back office kind of appreciation of some of the things that were going on there. One of them was our raters were giving people credit for the amount of training that they seemed to seek out. And we discovered that there was a relationship between military service and training that led to us focusing on the fact that if you're in the military, many areas of it, your full-time job is training. And that's why there is a lot of it associated with that. And so it's not the same thing as someone who does a job that's not so training focused, and they may have fewer instances of training, but they need to seek it out and go the extra mile in order to do that. So we changed some things in the way we train raters to look at those aspects of what people reported about their training. And we discovered that using WordStat, it was not something that was discovered in an automated way by the programs that were just scoring those. So back office use is certainly to make the HR professional a more intelligent consumer of scoring algorithms that are more sophisticated, that you'll probably hire a contractor to use. What the future might be with WordStat, I couldn't say. It's certainly possible to extend it in that direction. But right now, that's how I have used it and would use it. And I think I answered part of that question and have forgotten the second part. So if you'd remind me.
So the second question was about the resumes, if you can use the dictionary for 20 resumes.
Thank you. You could do that. I will say that a challenge in doing it in our context, and why it's probably not done more right now, is early on there is a program/service called Resumix that was adopted by many agencies in the federal government. Among them, I think, a number of defense agencies. And the people using Resumix within the government did not use it in the best way. In some cases, it got to a case of they'd find out what keywords were being used to identify resumes, and then people would, on the quiet, reveal those people who were applying. It just became a very bad thing. And none of that was the fault of the developers of Resumix. But because of that, it got a little bit of a bad, text analytics in that area got a little bit of a bad reputation that we're still overcoming. Yes, I think it could be used to do that. But in our context, it would be, right now, an uphill battle to do so. Again, none of that's the fault of text analytics.
Right, but you could use it, for example, if you were a car company or a retail company or whichever company, develop your dictionary. I guess this is where the question is coming from. Develop a specific dictionary for the type of skills and people that you were looking for, and score their resumes through that with WordStat. Yes,
you could. It would be good at identifying the degree to which they have particular skills that you're looking for. And this is probably obvious to everyone, but it's something we have to point out. It'll say whether the skills are there, but it does nothing really to guarantee that the person is telling the truth about those skills. And right. It's important to do something else to verify that beyond simply identifying their presence. And I think all of us would know that, but sometimes people who use programs in a more off-the-shelf way might overlook that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, John. From my perspective, I concur with everybody who said fantastic presentation. It's very much appreciated. For everybody who's listening, I'll repeat myself. We will be posting this on our website, the webinar section of our website, a recording of it. So you'll be able to see it or tell your friends about it, send them the links. to view the presentation. And John's slide with his contact information is still up there, and it'll also be in the recorded presentation. So if you need to get in touch with him, that's how to do it. So thank you very much, John. Much appreciated, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, and thank all of you. I look forward to hearing from some of you if you'd like to discuss further.
And one more piece, just a little bit more bit of advertising. Please go to our website. We have our next Lunch and Learn is coming up, I believe, in 2 weeks. I don't have it right in front of me. I should. I'm sorry about that. But we're going to be looking at, Adam, do you remember what it is? Open-ended questions or surveys? He's looking quickly.
Let me see. It's hold on a second. I believe it's next week. Yes, so it's next week, November the 9th, from noon to 1. So it's next Monday from noon to 1. And it's going to be Abby Jones, and the presentation will be about focus group. So how to analyze focus group data.
Okay, so please join us for that, and you can register on the website. And thank everybody for their time today. And John, again, thank you very much, and everybody have a great day.